6 hours in the air, and not a single heartbeat from the man in seat 2A. Emma Carter had worked red-eye flights for almost 3 years, long enough to recognize exhaustion, anxiety, even the subtle signs of a medical emergency at 36,000 feet. But this was different. This felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain, the kind of wrong that made her fingers tighten around the metal tray as she moved down the aisle, smiling automatically, nodding at passengers who barely looked at her. The cabin dimmed to a soft blue glow as most people tried to sleep, engines humming, steady like a distant storm. Everything normal, everything routine, except him. He hadn't moved since boarding, hadn't adjusted his seat, hadn't touched the glass of champagne she had placed on his tray table exactly 12 minutes ago. Condensation slowly sliding down the crystal, untouched, unnoticed, and yet he was awake. She could feel it, that strange awareness prickling along her skin like static. "Don't stare," she whispered to herself under her breath, forcing her posture straight as she approached, professionalism first, always. But as she stepped closer, the temperature seemed to drop, not enough for anyone else to notice, just enough to make her breath catch slightly, her training kicking in. "Sir, is everything all right?" Her voice was soft, practiced, calm, the way they taught them during emergency simulations. But inside her chest, her heart picked up speed, too fast, too loud, like it was compensating for something missing. The man's head tilted just slightly, too smooth, too precise, and then his eyes opened, instantly, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment, and Emma froze, because people didn't open their eyes like that. There was no grogginess, no adjustment to light, just immediate, sharp awareness, his gaze locking onto hers with a weight that made it hard to breathe, pale gray, almost silver, reflecting the dim cabin lights in a way that didn't feel natural. "You noticed," he said quietly, his voice low, controlled, carrying just enough authority to make her straighten instinctively. I'm sorry." Emma blinked, caught off guard, her training slipping for a fraction of a second, and that was when she felt it again. That silence. She focused without meaning to, the way flight attendants sometimes did when checking for signs of distress, listening for breath, for movement, for life. But there was nothing, no rhythm, no pulse, just an empty stillness where something human should have been. Her throat went dry. "Your heart," he continued, watching her carefully now, as if studying her reaction. "You can't hear mine, can you?" Emma didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was already sitting heavy in her chest, and somehow, impossibly, he knew it. The cabin lights flickered softly above them, a brief pulse of darkness before stabilizing again, a small turbulence warning chiming faintly in the distance. But no one else reacted. Passengers remained still, too still, a strange quiet settling over the entire section like a held breath. Emma's grip tightened around her tray, instincts screaming that something was very, very wrong. And yet she didn't step back, didn't call for assistance, didn't follow protocol, because his gaze held her there, not threatening, not aggressive, but intense in a way that felt almost magnetic. "You should go back to your station," he said after a moment, his tone softer now, but no less commanding. "This isn't your problem." But Emma shook her head before she even realized she was doing it, a small, stubborn motion, surprising even herself. "If something's wrong, it is my problem," she said, voice steadier than she felt. And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost imperceptible, but there, like a crack in something perfectly controlled. And then, 3 rows behind her, a seatbelt clicked open, too loud in the silence. Emma's head turned instinctively, catching sight of a man standing slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed not on her, but on seat 2A. And the air in the cabin seemed to change, tightening, sharpening, like the calm before something inevitable. "Ah," the man in 2A murmured, his gaze never leaving Emma. "Looks like they found us." Emma's stomach dropped. "Found who?" she whispered, but he only gave the faintest hint of a smile, cold and knowing. "Now you understand why I told you to leave," he said, rising from his seat with impossible grace. And as he stepped into the aisle, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, because from this moment on, his voice lowered, meant only for her. "You're no longer just a flight attendant." Emma did not move when he stepped into the aisle because something in her body refused to let her run even when every instinct told her to. The man 3 rows behind them was still standing now, watching with a calm that felt rehearsed, deliberate, his posture too straight, his breathing too controlled. And suddenly Emma noticed it again, the same unnatural stillness she had sensed from seat 2A. Except this one was different, colder, sharper, like intention wrapped in silence. "Stay behind me," the man from 2A said quietly without looking back at her, and Emma blinked because she had never been given an order like that before, not from a passenger, not in this tone. But somehow her feet obeyed anyway, shifting just slightly, the service tray still clutched in her hands like the only normal thing left in the world. The overhead lights flickered again, longer this time, casting shadows that stretched too far across the narrow aisle. Passengers remained seated, unmoving, their faces blank. In the dim glow, as if the entire cabin had slipped into a strange, suspended moment. "You should not have come this far," the standing man said finally, his voice calm, almost polite, but carrying an edge that made Emma's stomach tighten. The man in front of her tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. "And yet here you are," he replied, equally calm, equally controlled. Like two forces meeting in the quietest possible way, Emma's grip tightened, her mind racing through training, procedures, emergency codes, anything that could make sense of this situation. But nothing fit. Nothing explained why the air felt heavier, why her chest rose and fell faster while the rest of the cabin seemed frozen in time. "This flight was not meant for you," the standing man continued, taking one slow step forward, measured, precise, and Emma noticed the distance between them shrink without sound. No rush, no panic, just inevitability. "Plans change," the man from 2A answered simply. And then, for a brief second, he glanced back at Emma, his eyes softer again, not human, not warm, but different from before, aware, almost cautious. "You should not be here," he said quietly. And this time it did not sound like a command. It sounded like a warning. Emma swallowed, her voice barely steady. "I work here," she said. And even to her own ears it sounded small compared to everything else happening. But it was true. It was the only truth she could hold on to. And for a moment, something unreadable crossed his expression, like that answer mattered more than it should. Then the plane shifted slightly, a gentle roll that should have been routine turbulence. But in this silence it felt amplified. The overhead bins creaked softly, a faint vibration running through the floor beneath her feet. And suddenly Emma realized something else. Something that made her breath catch again. No one else was reacting. No gasps, no movement, no complaints, just stillness, as if they were no longer part of this moment at all. "What is happening to them?" she whispered, her eyes flicking toward the nearest row, but neither man answered her. Instead, the one in front of her stepped fully into the aisle now, placing himself between her and the other man without hesitation, his presence filling the narrow space in a way that felt absolute, final. "They will not remember this," he said quietly, and Emma did not know if he meant it as reassurance or something else entirely. The standing man stopped a few feet away now, close enough that Emma could see his eyes clearly, dark, focused, unwavering. "You cannot protect her," he said, his gaze shifting briefly toward Emma before returning. And that single look sent a chill down her spine because it was not curiosity, it was calculation. "I do not need to protect her," the man in front of her replied, his voice lower now, heavier, carrying something ancient. Beneath the calm surface, "I need to make sure she walks away." Emma's heart pounded harder at those words, confusion and fear twisting together, because no one had explained anything, and yet somehow she had already been pulled into something far beyond a delayed flight or a difficult passenger. The standing man exhaled slowly, almost disappointed. "You always choose the unpredictable path," he said, and then his gaze shifted again, this time lingering on Emma just a second longer. "That is why they will keep coming." Emma's fingers tightened around the tray until her knuckles turned pale. "Who is coming?" she asked. But neither of them answered immediately. Instead, the man in front of her stepped just a fraction closer, enough that she could feel that unnatural cold radiating from him again. And when he spoke this time, his voice was softer, almost careful, as if the words themselves carried weight. "The kind of people who do not let something like you go unnoticed." Emma's breath caught. Something like me, she repeated quietly, and that was when his eyes sharpened again, locking onto hers with that same impossible intensity from before. You heard what no one else can hear, he said. You saw what no one else can see. The plane shifted again, slightly stronger this time, a subtle warning chime echoing faintly through the cabin, and Emma realized with a growing certainty that this flight, this moment, everything about tonight, had already changed, and there was no going back. Emma Carter had spent years memorizing emergency protocols, but none of them applied to a moment where the world seemed to pause around her, while two men spoke in quiet tones about things that should not exist. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she tried to steady her breathing, but the silence pressed in tighter, heavier, and the realization settled deep that this was no longer a situation she could report over an intercom or fix with a calm smile. You think they will stop at one attempt, the man behind them said, his voice carrying a faint trace of something almost amused, and Emma felt the words more than she understood them, like a warning wrapped in certainty. The man in front of her did not turn, did not react outwardly, but the air shifted again, subtle yet unmistakable. They rarely do, he replied, his tone measured, as if he had lived this moment many times before. Emma's fingers trembled slightly against the tray as she glanced toward the cabin once more. Rows of passengers sitting motionless, faces blank, breathing so faint it was almost invisible. You said they will not remember this, she whispered, her voice barely steady. What does that mean? And this time he answered her without hesitation. It means their minds are no longer part of this moment, he said quietly. And Emma's stomach tightened because that explanation only raised more questions than it answered. You mean they are unconscious, she pressed, needing something real, something she could define. But he shook his head just slightly. No, he said, they are simply not here. The words sent a chill through her chest because there was something final in the way he said it, something that told her she was the exception, not the rule, and exceptions in situations like this rarely ended well. The man behind them took another slow step forward, his gaze never leaving the one standing between them. You always underestimate how quickly they adapt, he said, and Emma noticed the faintest change in his tone now, less calm, more deliberate, like a conversation reaching its turning point. And you always assume they can control what they find, the man in front of her replied, his voice lowering, steady and absolute. Emma's mind raced, trying to piece together fragments of meaning from words that felt just out of reach. What did you mean? She asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. When you said something like me. For a brief second neither man spoke, and in that silence the weight of her question seemed to settle between them. The man in front of her finally turned his head just enough to look at her again, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharper now, more focused, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You noticed the absence, he said slowly. Most humans cannot perceive what is missing. They only react to what is present. Emma frowned slightly, confusion mixing with a growing unease. I do not understand, she admitted, and this time he stepped closer, just enough that his voice dropped lower, meant only for her, that is. Because you are listening in a way others do not, he said. You felt the silence where there should have been life. Emma's breath caught again, her heart racing as the pieces began to shift into place. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to know this was not random, not coincidence. The man behind them exhaled softly, almost impatient now. We are running out of time, he said, and for the first time Emma sensed something beneath his calm. Not fear, but urgency, controlled and precise. The plane gave another subtle shudder, the kind that usually went unnoticed, but in this suspended moment it felt like a signal, like something approaching. Then you should leave, the man in front of her replied without turning, before this becomes something you cannot contain. The other man's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. You know that is not an option, he said, and Emma felt the tension sharpen instantly, like a line drawn that neither would cross. What happens if he does not leave? She asked, her voice quieter now, but steadier, because somewhere beneath the fear a different emotion had begun to form, a need to understand, to stay present, even when everything told her to step away. The man in front of her did not answer right away, and when he finally did, his voice carried something heavier than before. something that made her chest tighten. "Then this flight will not end the way it was supposed to," he said, and Emma realized with a sudden clarity that whatever was about to happen next had already begun long before she ever walked down this aisle. And somehow, without knowing how or why, she had already become part of it. Emma Carter realized something had changed, not in the cabin, not in the two men facing each other, but inside her, because the fear that had been tightening around her chest since this began was no longer the only thing she felt. There was something else now, something quieter, but stronger, a clarity that refused to let her step back, even when every instinct told her to disappear into the safety of routine. "You said they will keep coming," she said, her voice low but steady enough to cut through the silence, and for the first time, both men acknowledged her words at the same time, the man behind them tilting his head slightly, while the one in front of her went still, as if weighing whether to answer. "They already are," the man behind them said calmly, and that was when Emma felt it, not heard, not seen, but felt like a shift in the air pressure itself, something approaching from beyond the thin walls of the aircraft, something unseen, but undeniable. Her breath caught as her eyes flicked toward the cabin windows, where only darkness stretched endlessly outside, but it no longer felt empty, it felt occupied. "What is out there?" she asked, and this time the man in front of her answered immediately, his voice quieter than before, but carrying a weight that made her heart pound harder. "Consequences," he said, and the words settled over her like something inevitable. The plane gave a subtle vibration, not turbulence, not mechanical, but something deeper, as if the very structure was responding to whatever presence had drawn near. "You should not have let her stay aware," the man behind them continued, his gaze now sharper, more focused. "It complicates things." The man in front of her exhaled slowly, and Emma noticed the smallest shift in his posture, not weakness, not hesitation, but calculation. She was never supposed to notice at all, he said, and Emma felt that sentence hit harder than anything else, because it confirmed what she already feared. This was not an accident. She was not meant to be part of this moment, and yet here she was. "Then fix it," the other man replied simply, and the words hung in the air heavier than anything before. Emma's grip tightened around the tray, again her mind racing, because even without understanding everything, she understood that word fix. It meant something final, something that would erase her from whatever this was. "No," the man in front of her said, and the answer came instantly, without hesitation, and for the first time, there was something unmistakable in his voice, something firm, something absolute. "That is not an option." The silence that followed felt sharper than before, as if even the air itself had paused to register that choice. Emma's heart pounded louder, now not just from fear but from something else, something she could not name, because he had chosen not to erase her, not to remove her from this impossible situation, and that choice mattered more than it should have. "You are making this personal," the man behind them said, his tone quieter now, but edged with something colder. "It always becomes personal when the variables change," the man in front of her replied, and then he turned to look at Emma fully this time, not just a glance, not just a warning, but a direct, steady gaze that held her in place. "Listen carefully," he said, and something in the way he spoke made her focus completely, every instinct narrowing to his voice alone. "Whatever happens next, you do not move unless I tell you to. You do not speak unless I ask you to, and you do not look at anything except me." Emma swallowed hard, but nodded before she could question it, because somehow she knew those instructions were not about control, they were about keeping her grounded in a moment that was about to shift again. The plane shuddered slightly stronger this time, a low hum passing through the floor beneath her feet, and the overhead lights dimmed just enough to cast longer shadows across the cabin. "They are here," the man behind them said softly, and for the first time, there was no trace of calm left in his voice, only certainty. Emma's breath hitched as she felt that pressure again, stronger now, closer, like standing near the edge of something vast and unseen. Her eyes flickered toward the windows again before she caught herself forcing her focus back to him, just as he had instructed, and when she did, she saw at the faintest change in his expression, not fear, not uncertainty, but something deeper, something older, as if whatever was coming was something he had faced before countless times, and yet this time was different because of her. "Remember what you felt," he said quietly, his gaze locked onto hers. "The silence, the absence, that is how you will know what is real." Emma nodded again, her pulse racing as the weight of his words settled in, because whatever was about to happen would not follow any rule she had ever known. And then the cabin fell completely, still, no hum, no vibration, no movement, just a single Suspended moment, and in that silence Emma Carter understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was no longer just a flight, it was a boundary between two worlds, and she had already crossed it. Emma Carter did exactly what he told her to do. She did not move, she did not speak, and she did not look away even when every instinct inside her screamed to turn toward the windows, toward the pressure building, just beyond the thin metal walls of the aircraft. Her entire focus locked onto him, the only stable point in a reality that was starting to fracture. "Good," he said quietly, and there was something almost approving in his tone, something that made her chest tighten in a way she did not understand, because nothing about this situation should have felt grounding, and yet his voice did that. The silence stretched longer, now thicker, like the air itself had weight, and then it shifted, not violently, not suddenly, but deliberately, like a door opening somewhere unseen. Emma felt it immediately, a presence, not one, but several, moving closer, not physically walking down the aisle, but existing just outside perception, brushing against the edges of her awareness. Her breath became shallow, her pulse loud in her ears. "Do not react," he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers. "They are testing you." Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay still even as the sensation intensified. It was like standing in a room full of people who were all watching her, without making a sound, without breathing, without existing in any way she could prove. And then she heard it, not a voice, not exactly, more like a thought brushing against her mind, faint, distant, but unmistakable, interesting. It whispered, and Emma's fingers twitched before she caught herself, her grip tightening again around the tray. "She can perceive us." Another presence noted, colder, sharper. That was not part of the design. The pressure increased just slightly, enough to make her chest tighten, and for a split second, she wanted to look around to find them, to understand where they were, but she remembered his words and forced herself to stay locked on him. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened just enough to tell her he had noticed her reaction. "Stay with me," he said, and this time there was no room for doubt in his voice. Emma nodded almost imperceptibly, her breathing slow and controlled as she focused on him, the only thing that felt real. "You brought an anomaly onto this flight," the unseen presence said again, its tone shifting, now more deliberate, more focused. "That was not my intention," he replied calmly, but there was something beneath his voice now, something heavier, something that felt like restraint. "Intent does not alter consequence," the presence answered, and Emma felt that word again, consequence, echo through her mind, stronger than before, as if it carried more weight. The plane gave another subtle vibration, the lights dimming further, casting the cabin into a deeper blue, and for a moment Emma could almost see them, not clearly, not fully, just shadows that did not match the shapes of the seats or the walls, like distortions in the air itself. Watching, waiting, calculating, her breath hitched. But she did not look away. She could not look away, because the moment she did, she knew she would lose whatever fragile control she still had. "She is not one of us," another voice observed, quieter, but more curious. "No," the first presence replied, "but she is no longer entirely separate either." Emma's heart pounded harder at those words, confusion and fear twisting together, because she did not understand what that meant, but she understood that it changed everything. "Explain," she said suddenly, the word slipping out before she could stop it, and the moment it left her lips, the silence sharpened instantly, the pressure around her intensifying, as if her voice had broken an unspoken rule. "I told you not to speak," he said quietly, not angry, not harsh, but firm, and Emma's breath caught as she realized what she had done. "She speaks without permission," the presence noted, and this time there was something colder in its tone, something less curious, more decisive. "She is not bound," another voice added. "That makes her unstable." Emma felt her chest tighten at that word, unstable, as if it placed her on the edge of something she could not see. "She is not unstable," he said, and for the first time there was a clear edge in his voice, not raised, not loud, but unmistakably protective, and the shift in tone sent a ripple through the unseen presence around them. "You are choosing to define her," the first voice said slowly. "That is a dangerous position." Emma's pulse raced faster, now her thoughts spiraling, because none of this made sense, and yet it all felt too real, too immediate to deny. "Then redefine the situation," he replied, his gaze still locked onto hers, unwavering. "Because she is not leaving this flight as something you can erase." The silence that followed was heavier than anything before, and Emma realized in that moment that whatever these unseen forces were, they were deciding something about her, something that would determine what happened next. And for the first time since this began, she understood with absolute clarity that her presence here was no longer an accident, it was a turning point. Emma Carter felt the shift the moment the silence broke, not with sound, but with intention. The unseen presence that had surrounded them just moments ago was no longer simply observing, it was deciding, and the weight of that realization pressed down on her chest harder than anything before. Her breathing slowed, not because she was calm, but because something deeper inside her was forcing her to focus, to remain present exactly as he had instructed her to do. You are interfering with a process that has already been set in motion. The first presence said, its voice no longer distant, but closer now, more defined, as if whatever barrier had separated them was beginning to thin. Emma kept her eyes locked on him, refusing to turn, refusing to acknowledge anything else, even as the pressure in the cabin intensified. Then adjust the process, he replied, his tone steady, unyielding. And for the first time, Emma noticed something else in his voice, not just control, not just authority, but resistance. Something that felt like it had been built over centuries and was now being tested. That is not how this works. Another presence responded, colder, sharper, and Emma felt the temperature around her drop again, just slightly enough to send a shiver through her arms. It is now, he said, and this time the words carried weight enough that even Emma could feel the shift, the unseen forces around them reacting not with movement, but with attention focused entirely on him. You are choosing to anchor yourself to an anomaly. The first presence continued, and Emma felt that word again, anomaly, echo through her mind, stronger, now clearer, as if it was defining her in a way she could not escape. I am choosing to acknowledge what is already there, he replied without hesitation, his gaze never leaving hers, and for a brief second Emma forgot the fear, forgot the pressure, forgot everything except the way he was looking at her, not as a problem, not as something to remove, but as something that mattered. And that realization struck deeper than anything else because it changed the balance of this moment completely. You are altering the outcome, the presence said slowly, and Emma felt something shift again, like a line being redrawn somewhere beyond her understanding. Outcomes change when new variables appear, he answered calmly, and this time there was no hesitation, no doubt in his voice, just certainty. Emma's pulse raced faster, because she understood enough now to realize what he was doing. He was not denying what she was, he was redefining it. Then define her, the presence said, and for the first time, there was something different in its tone, not curiosity, not judgment, but expectation, as if they were waiting for him to answer a question that would determine everything that followed. The silence that came next felt endless, stretched thin across the entire cabin, as if even the aircraft itself was waiting. Emma's breath caught her chest tight as she realized this was the moment, the decision, the turning point. And then he spoke. She is aware, he said simply, and the words settled into the air with a weight that felt absolute. She perceives absence, she recognizes what should not exist, and she does not turn away from it. Emma's heart pounded harder with each word, because they were not just describing her, they were defining her in a way she had never considered before. That does not make her one of us. Another presence countered quickly. No, he agreed, but it means she is no longer separate either. Emma's breath hitched at that statement, the finality in it impossible to ignore, because it confirmed what she had been feeling since the moment she stepped into this aisle. She had crossed something she could not uncross. And what does that make her? The first presence asked, and this time the question carried weight, purpose, direction. Emma felt her pulse in her throat, her fingers tightening around the tray as she waited for the answer that would decide everything. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but stronger than before, as if every word was chosen with precision. It makes her someone you cannot erase without consequence. The silence that followed was different from before, not heavy, not oppressive, but sharp, focused, like a decision settling into place. The pressure in the cabin shifted again, not disappearing, but changing, no longer pressing down, but pulling back slightly, as if reassessing, recalculating. You are binding yourself to this outcome, the presence said slowly, and for the first time, there was something almost cautionary in its tone. I am acknowledging it, he replied, and Emma felt something inside her steady for the first time since this began, not because the danger was gone, but because it had been named, defined in a way that made it real. Then understand this, the presence continued, its voice lowering slightly, as if the next words carried more weight than anything before. If she remains aware, she will be seen not just by us, but by others, by those who do not negotiate, who Do not reconsider who do not allow exceptions. Emma's breath caught her chest tightening again, because she understood what that meant even without knowing who they were. Then they will have to deal with me, he said, and the calm certainty in his voice sent a ripple through the air itself, the kind of certainty that did not need to be proven because it simply existed. That is a risk you cannot fully control. The presence replied, and for the first time Emma sensed something unexpected beneath. Its words, not threat, not warning, but acknowledgement. Nothing worth choosing ever is, he answered quietly, and the silence that followed was no longer filled with pressure, but with something else, something that felt like a line had been crossed and accepted. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the presence around them began to fade, not disappearing completely, but withdrawing just enough for the cabin to feel real again, the hum of the engines returning faintly, the lights stabilizing slightly, the world shifting back into something that resembled normal. But Emma knew it was not normal, not anymore, because as she stood there still locked in place, her eyes still fixed on him, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever he had just done, whatever decision had just been made, it had changed the course of everything that would come next, and there was no going back. Emma Carter felt the world return in fragments, first the low hum of the engines vibrating beneath her feet, then the faint flicker of cabin lights stabilizing overhead, and finally, the almost imperceptible shift of passengers breathing around her, as if nothing had ever happened, as if the last several minutes had not existed at all. But she knew better, because the silence, she had felt the absence, she had recognized it was still there, lingering at the edges of her awareness like something watching. From just beyond sight, her grip on the tray loosened slightly as she exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes, but her eyes never left him. They are gone, she said quietly, her voice steadier now, not because she was calm, but because something inside her had changed, something that refused to let her retreat back into ignorance. He nodded once, a small, controlled motion. For now, he replied, and those two words settled heavily between them, because they carried a certainty that this was not over, not even close. Emma swallowed, her gaze flickering briefly toward the cabin, where passengers were beginning to shift again, subtle movements, someone adjusting a blanket, another reaching for a glass of water, small normal actions that felt almost unreal after what she had just experienced. They do not remember, she said more to herself than to him, and he did not correct her. They were never part of it, he answered instead, and Emma felt that distinction clearly now, not just something she was told, but something she understood. Because she had felt the difference, she had stood inside a moment that did not belong to the rest of the world. And me, she asked, her voice quieter now as she looked back at him fully. What am I part of? The question lingered in the air longer than she expected, and for a moment he did not answer, his gaze steady on hers, as if considering how much to say, or perhaps how much she was ready to hear. You are part of a boundary, he said finally, and the word sent a ripple through her chest because it matched exactly what she had felt earlier, that invisible line between two worlds, a boundary between what exists and what is allowed to be seen. He continued, his tone calm but precise. Most people live their entire lives without ever noticing it, but you crossed it the moment you recognized what was missing. Emma's heart beat faster at that memory, the silence, the absence, the impossible stillness, where something human should have been. And now I cannot go back, she said, and it was not a question this time, it was a realization spoken out loud. He did not hesitate. No, he said simply, and there was no cruelty in the answer, only truth. Emma exhaled slowly, her mind racing, but no longer in panic. Instead, it was trying to understand, to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. Those voices, she said carefully, they were not like you. He tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the observation. No, they were not, he replied. They operate differently. They observe, they decide, they enforce balance where it is required. Emma frowned slightly, the words forming a shape in her mind that she was not sure she wanted to fully understand. And you, she asked, where do you stand in all of that? For a brief second something shifted in his expression, not enough to define, but enough to notice. I exist within it, but I do not answer to it in the same way, he said, and Emma felt the weight of that answer because it explained something she had already sensed, the way he had spoken to those unseen presences, the way he had stood his ground without hesitation. You challenged them, she said quietly, and this time there was no uncertainty in her voice. He did not deny it. I corrected their assumption, he replied, and the calm certainty in his tone made it clear that to him, there was no difference. Emma's fingers tightened slightly against the tray again as the reality of that settled in. Because of me, she said, and this time it was not fear in her voice, it was something closer to disbelief. He looked at her then fully, his gaze steady, unwavering. Because of what you are capable of perceiving, he said, and because you did not turn away from it. The cabin around them continued to return to normal, the soft murmur of passengers waking, the faint sound of a call button chiming somewhere in the distance, the world reasserting itself as if nothing had happened. But Emma knew that normal was no longer something she could step back into. What happens when we land? She asked, and this time the question carried weight, direction, consequences. Gaze held hers for a moment longer before he answered. That depends on who is waiting for us, he said. And something in the way he said it made her chest tighten again, not with fear, but with anticipation, because she understood now that whatever came next would not be hidden inside silence or absence. It would be real, visible, undeniable. And as the plane continued its steady path through the night, Emma Carter realized that the moment they touched the ground, the boundary she had crossed would not disappear. It would follow her into the world she thought she knew, and everything about her life would begin to change. Emma Carter felt the shift long before the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their initial descent, the plane dipping just slightly as it began its slow drop from 36,000 feet toward the city lights far below. But this shift was different. It was not mechanical, not routine. It was awareness, the kind that settled into her bones and refused to leave. Her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of a seat as she steadied herself in the aisle, her training telling her to resume normal duties, to smile, to reassure passengers, to prepare the cabin for landing. But nothing about her felt normal anymore. We are getting closer, she said quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. He was already watching her, his expression unreadable, but his attention sharp, as if he had been waiting for her to notice it. Yes, he replied simply, and that single word carried more weight than anything else, because it confirmed what she already felt. This was not just a descent, it was an approach to something waiting. Emma glanced briefly toward the windows where the darkness outside had softened into distant patterns of light, highways stretching like veins through the city. Clusters of buildings glowing faintly against the night sky. Everything looked ordinary from this height, but she knew better now. Appearances meant nothing. You said it depends on who is waiting, she said, bringing her focus back to him. What if it is them? He did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting just slightly past her shoulder, as if measuring something unseen before returning to her. Then they will not wait for permission, he said calmly, and Emma felt her chest tighten at the certainty in his voice. And if it is not them, she pressed. He studied her for a moment longer, as if deciding how much truth to give her before speaking again. Then it will be someone who understands what you have become. Emma's breath caught slightly at that word become, because it implied something had already changed, something irreversible. I did not choose this, she said quietly, more to herself than to him, but his response came without hesitation. No, he said, but you chose not to look away, and that is what matters. The cabin around them was fully awake now, passengers shifting in their seats, adjusting seatbelts, reaching for bags, the normal sounds of a flight preparing to land filling the space. Yet to Emma, it all felt distant, like she was standing slightly outside of it all, observing rather than belonging. What am I supposed to do when we land? She asked, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just a need for direction, for something solid to hold on to. He stepped just slightly closer, not enough to draw attention, but enough that his presence felt more defined, more real against the chaos returning around them. You stay aware, he said quietly. You listen the way you did before. You recognize what does not belong even when everything else tells you it does. Emma nodded slowly, her pulse steadying, not because the situation was safe, but because she understood her role in it now, not fully, not completely, but enough to stand her ground. And you? She asked, her eyes locking onto his. What will you do? For a brief moment something shifted in his expression again, something deeper, something that hinted at a history far beyond this flight. I will make sure no one takes advantage of what you have become, he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice sent a strange warmth through her chest despite the cold that still lingered around him. The plane dipped again, this time more noticeably, the landing gear beginning to extend with a low mechanical hum, and Emma felt the ground drawing closer. The boundary he had spoken about, no longer something abstract, but something they were about to cross together. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. The captain's voice echoed through the cabin, steady and routine, and for a moment Emma almost laughed at how normal it sounded compared to everything else that had happened. She moved automatically, checking the nearest rows, her motions precise, practiced, but her awareness remained fixed on him, on the space around him, on the subtle shifts she could now feel without trying. They are already here, he said quietly as she stepped back toward him, and Emma's breath caught because she felt it too, not as strong as before, not overwhelming, but present, a faint pressure threading through the cabin like a shadow woven into the light. Where? She whispered, her eyes scanning the rows instinctively, but nothing looked out of place. Every passenger appeared normal, calm, unaware. That is the point, he replied, and his gaze sharpened slightly. They do not need to reveal themselves until it is too late. Emma's pulse quickened again, but this time she did not panic. She focused instead, reaching for that same awareness he had told her to trust. And then she felt it, a small absence, not near him, not near the aisle, but further back, hidden within the normal rhythm of breathing and movement, something that did not quite align, something that did not belong there. She said softly before she could stop herself, and his attention shifted instantly, following her focus without question. Good, he said, and for the first time there was something unmistakable in his voice, not just approval, but certainty, as if she had just confirmed something important. So this is how it begins, he added quietly, and Emma realized with a sudden clarity that this moment, this descent, this quiet recognition of something hidden among ordinary people was not the end of what had started on this flight. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that would not stay contained within the walls of an aircraft. As the city lights grew brighter beneath them, and the ground rose to meet them, Emma Carter understood that whatever was waiting below had already found her, and this time there would be no silence to hide it. Emma Carter felt it the moment the plane touched down, not the wheels against the runway, not the controlled deceleration as the engines reversed and the cabin shifted forward in unison, but something deeper, something quieter. The boundary had moved. It was no longer suspended at 36,000 feet. It had followed them to the ground. The city lights outside no longer felt distant or harmless. They felt closer, sharper, like something within them was already aware of her presence. Her fingers rested lightly against the back of a seat as the aircraft slowed to a steady roll, the familiar sounds of arrival filling the cabin, seatbelts clicking open, overhead bins unlocking, voices rising in casual conversation, everything normal, everything routine, and yet none of it reached her the same way anymore. Stay focused, he said quietly from beside her, and she nodded once, her eyes scanning the cabin, not for movement, not for faces, but for absence, for the subtle misalignment she had learned to recognize. And it was there, faint but undeniable, woven into the ordinary like a shadow that did not belong. They did not wait, she said under her breath, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, only recognition. He followed her gaze for a fraction of a second before stepping slightly closer, his presence calm, controlled, but unmistakably alert. They rarely do, he replied, and Emma felt the truth of that settle into her chest as the plane came to a complete stop. The soft chime signaling arrival echoing overhead, passengers began to stand, reaching for bags, stepping into the aisle, unaware of anything beyond their own routines. But Emma did not move, not yet, because she could still feel it, that presence, not outside, not approaching, but already here, already among them. What happens now? She asked, her voice low, steady, grounded in a way she had never felt before. He did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted toward the front of the cabin, toward the closed door, where the jet bridge would soon connect, the final barrier between this contained space and the world beyond. Now we see who makes the first move, he said, and the words carried a quiet certainty that made her pulse steady instead of race, because she understood this was no longer about avoiding something. It was about facing it. The cabin door opened with a soft mechanical sound, a rush of cooler air entering as the first passengers began to step forward into the narrow passage leading out into the terminal. Emma watched them carefully, one by one, their movements, their breathing, their presence, and then she saw it, not a person, not clearly defined, but a space within the flow of people where something did not align, a subtle absence where there should have been weight, where there should have been life. There, she said softly, her voice barely audible, and his attention shifted instantly, confirming what she had already sensed. You see it clearly now, he said, and there was no doubt in his tone. Emma nodded, her heart steady, her mind sharp, because whatever hesitation she had felt before was gone, replaced by something stronger, something unshakable. "I cannot unsee it," she replied, and this time it did not feel like a weakness, it felt like truth. He studied her for a moment longer, and then for the first time since this began, something in his expression changed, not softened, not less dangerous, but different, as if he was no longer deciding whether she belonged here, but accepting that she already did. "Good," he said quietly, and the word carried weight, finality, recognition. Because once you see it, you become part of what comes next. Emma took a slow breath, her eyes still fixed on that subtle distortion, moving ahead with the flow of passengers, blending perfectly into the ordinary, while remaining completely separate from it. "And what comes next?" she asked, and this time her voice did not waver at all. He stepped forward into the aisle, his movement smooth, deliberate, as he followed the path toward the exit, and she understood without being told that she was meant to follow the world you thought you knew. He said as he glanced back at her one last time, his eyes holding hers with that same impossible intensity from the very beginning, "is about to show you what it has been hiding." Emma Carter did not hesitate. She stepped forward, leaving behind the narrow space of the aircraft, stepping into the unknown beyond it. And as she crossed that final threshold, she felt it. Clearly the boundary was gone. There was no separation anymore, no silence to protect her from what existed just beneath the surface. And somewhere within the flow of people ahead, something that did not belong slowed just enough to acknowledge her presence. And in that moment, Emma understood with absolute certainty this was not the end of what had started on that flight. It was the beginning of something that would follow her far beyond it, into a world where nothing was as ordinary as it seemed, and where she was no longer invisible to the things that watched from the dark.